recap talk here. I would like to acknowledge tonight that we are on Treaty 4 territory, traditional lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and the homeland of the Métis. Prairie Wind and Silver Sage is a nonprofit organization working in partnership with the local community and Grasslands National Park to promote conservation of native prairie and prairie culture. So feel free after the talk to enjoy our native prairie and prairie culture museum next door in the other room and our gift shop in this room. We've got some special things going on. It's our 25th anniversary this year. So Prairie Wind and Silver Sage has been open for 25 years as this organization. We have a 25th anniversary calendar, compliments of photographs by a local photographer, James Page, who does all of his photography with respect to distance from animals. So, and they're beautiful photographs. So I'll pass these around, you guys can have a look real quick. And you can just put them on the back when you're done. We also have a silent online auction. The auction items are actually in our museum in the corner there. You'll see that there's a big painting and a couple other items. So that's our silent auction. If you need any details, they'll be on the back counter there. And we also have our 25th anniversary 50/50 Lotto fundraiser. So feel free to grab one of these on your way out and you can check it out. If you need help getting a 50/50 Lotto ticket or checking out the silent auction, just let us know. Noreen and I will be back there to help you. So I'll pass off the floor to Caitlin. Thank you so much, Caitlin. Thanks.
So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Caitlin Seiler, and I'm the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. And we're actually a subcommittee of the Saskatchewan Stock Growers Association. We host a monthly Native Prairie speaker series, either in person or online, and it's really good to be back doing it in person. And we've always held one here at Prairie Wind, so it's really, really nice to be back here. So before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. And for millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I'd like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. I also want to mention that as part of our Native Prairie Speaker Series, we have a webinar going on October 6th about migratory birds at Chaplin Lake. And it's by Masters of Science student Kayla Caruso, who's studying at the University of Saskatchewan, and that one's available online, and it'll be at 12 p.m. This presentation's being uploaded, so if you have to miss part of it, or you want to swing by, or you want to catch another PCAP presentation, they're all uploaded to the PCAP YouTube channel, and you can check it out after the fact. This one probably will get there next week, just being Thanksgiving and all. But yeah, without further ado, I'm happy to introduce Ian. So Ian's work with Birds Canada focuses on finding solutions that are mutually beneficial for birds, the environment, producers, and society at large. As the Grassland Conservation Manager for Birds Canada, Ian works at the interface of agriculture and conservation to find solutions to conserve grassland ecosystems and drive positive biodiversity outcomes in our working landscapes. Ian grew up on a mixed farm in western Manitoba, holds a Bachelor's of Science in Agriculture from the University of Manitoba, is a certified crop advisor and a professional agrologist. So with that, I'll pass it over to Ian.
Great, thank you very much, Caitlin. That was a mouthful of bio that I sent in, I guess. Great, thank you very much. Yeah, so today I'm going to just be talking on some of the work that we do at Birds Canada and some of the general threats and opportunities for grassland conservation and grassland bird conservation. So just to start off with a little bit about Birds Canada, the organization that I work for. We're a non-profit charitable organization, and we've been around in one form or another since 1960. We started as the Long Point Bird Observatory on the North Shore of Lake Erie down in southern Ontario, and we've grown to a national organization from there. And we have operations across the country now, including here on the Prairies. So our mission really is to drive action to increase the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of birds in Canada. You'll see that tagline on a lot of our things, understand, appreciate, and conserve is really our focus. And we do that through a number of different ways, but a lot of our focus is through citizen science and also just general science that we do, as well as advocacy and on-the-ground conservation. So I'm just going to adjust a little bit so I can see my notes a little bit better. So yeah, so we view the world through how we can help birds, and obviously people are a big portion of that. And either through citizen science or here on the prairies, producers and landowners are a really big part of that. So as the Grassland Conservation Manager, as Caitlin mentioned, I get to work kind of at the intersection of agriculture and conservation and find ways to conserve grassland ecosystems and really try to integrate biodiversity within our working landscape. So I get to work with farmers and ranchers quite a lot, which, as Caitlin mentioned, I grew up with farmers and ranchers and have spent my whole career working with producers. So I'm really fortunate to be able to continue to do that. And I also get to work in a really complex and beautiful landscape, as you all know. And I get to work with a fascinating group of birds that unfortunately have seen some of the largest declines among bird groups in Canada. Unfortunately, we've lost nearly 60% of our grassland birds since 1970, and along with aerial insectivores who also rely largely on this landscape, or a lot of them rely on this landscape, have seen the largest declines. Those two bird groups have seen the largest declines in Canada. So many of you will know this, but the things that are driving these population declines are largely the loss and degradation of the grassland ecosystems. We've lost around 75 to 90% of the native prairie that once existed before European settlement. Here in Saskatchewan, that's somewhere between 15 and 20% that we estimate. And just unfortunately, we continue to lose that at a fairly staggering rate. If we include the northern Great Plains, so some of those northern states like Montana and the Dakotas, we lose around 550,000 acres of grassland every year, which works out to about an acre every minute on average. So if we think about some of the grassland birds that require or that need this landscape, they usually need to stake out around 1 to 2 acres on the grassland to raise their young, and they defend kind of 1 to 2 acre territory. So unfortunately, they're losing potential homes fairly quickly. There are a few things that are driving this habitat loss and degradation. Resource extraction. So a lot of these grassland birds tend to be really sensitive to linear structures, and as well to the invasive species that often come along with that. So when we build roads and that sort of thing, that just tends to fragment and shrink the space that they can use, because they'll give those things a fairly wide berth and they won't nest next to those roads and that sort of thing. Like I mentioned, invasive species obviously play quite a large role in that. I'll talk about it a little bit more in depth, but grassland birds are really sensitive to the structure of the habitat and the vegetation that's there. That's mostly what they'll key in on when they're trying to decide where to put their nests in the spring. So when we have invasive species, they tend to kind of homogenize that height and the plant community there. So grassland birds typically like more of a mosaic of heights, and those invasive species tend to kind of just make all one height. So that's a threat to them as far as degradation of habitat. In the absence of fire, for the most part on the landscape now, particularly where it's a little bit wetter, where I am in western Manitoba, shrub encroachment is a fairly big concern. Lots of these grassland birds, again, like to have wide open grassland, and will avoid areas that have had shrubs over 1 meter for the most part. So those are places that predators can perch, and they'll tend to avoid nesting in those areas. So that's one of the other threats that's degrading the habitat for them. But the biggest one that's contributing to the actual loss of habitat is the conversion of grasslands to annual agriculture, and that's largely driven by economic factors, where it often just makes a lot more financial sense sometimes, if you're able to support annual agriculture or grain farming, to till up grasslands and use it for annual agriculture. So that's one of the things that's really driving a lot of the grassland losses here on the Canadian prairies. So as Kayla mentioned and as I mentioned, I come from an ag background. I will put a caveat on that I am not a grassland bird biologist, but I have learned quite a bit about them in the last couple of years. So I'll share what I know, and I'll share what I have been able to learn over the last couple of years, and I use a lot of PCAB resources to learn that. And there may be some of you that might be able to contribute to this conversation as well. So I say something that's wrong, and you can stick up your hand, or if you have any questions, we can have a bit of a discussion on that as well. So I've just picked out 4 kind of the iconic species of grassland birds that are seeing some of the heavier declines and that are fairly reliant on native pastures, and I thought we'd just talk a little bit about them and learn a little bit about them, hopefully, and maybe I'll learn something too from some of you. So the first one is the chestnut collar longspur, which is a grassland songbird that you'll get around here quite a lot. The pictures that I have are of both of the males of chestnut collar longspurs. That's because they're the most recognizable and the ones that you'll see the most often, as the females tend to be a little bit more inconspicuous, and these are the guys that you'll see the most often. So they're quite striking for a grassland bird, actually. I started off with probably the most striking bird of the night. It has that black belly, and they've got the yellow on the throat and up on their face, and then of course that rust colored on their nape, which is where they get the chestnut color from, part of their name from. Something else that you can use if you're out looking for these birds is that they'll have white outer tail feathers, and then they have a black triangle in their tail, which is fairly distinctive. So both the males and the females will have this. So if you see a bird fly away from you and you see that black triangle, it's probably a chestnut collar longspur. I was going to try to add in the calls and the songs, but I just couldn't figure out a way to really seamlessly put that in. So if you're curious, we can listen to them maybe after the presentation. But they have got a musical song that I think is a little bit similar to a meadowlark that has a cold. And it's fairly raspy, but it is quite a musical song, and it's really quite pretty. And again, that's going to be the males that are singing for the most part, and they'll sing either from their perch, like we see on the bottom there on a wire, or they'll sing while they're doing their flight display, which my colleague Yusuf managed to get a nice picture of. So, and then they get their name longspur. There are 3 different types of longspurs that we get in Saskatchewan, and they get their name from this big long claw on the back of their back toe, and that's where they get their longspur name. And kind of an interesting little thing about these birds is that they'll often nest right next to cowpies. And from what I can read and from my colleagues, there's a bit of a discussion on why they do that. It could be that, as we'll get into, these birds like places that are a little bit shorter grass, so that cowpie might just provide a little bit extra cover for them, kind of improve that microclimate, maybe make it a little bit warmer when it's cold in the spring. Or it could be that it helps to kind of mask their scent a little bit and keeps them hidden from predators, or it could be that insects are more attracted to those cowpies and it makes them a little bit easier, or makes it a little bit easier to forage, because these birds will typically eat mostly insects during the breeding season, but they'll also eat some seeds as well. So, in terms of the habitat conditions that these birds will like, this is mostly, you'll find them in places a little bit drier and places that have been grazed a little bit more intensely for the most part. They like kind of that low to mid-height vegetation, so 7 to 15 centimeters. 15 centimeters is about the height of a pencil. So anything sort of below that is something that they'll typically like. And they do like some bare ground and really quite a low amount of litter. So if you're scratching and doing a range health assessment, there's really not going to be a lot of litter that you're going to find in terms of when you're in chestnut collar longspur habitat. So in general terms, if you are doing a range health score, something that scores kind of fair to good is going to be close to chestnut color larkspur habitat. That's not something that's perfectly applicable in all ways, but in terms of the bare ground that's there and the amount of litter, that's kind of what these birds would be looking for. And they tend to avoid areas with trees, shrubs, like I mentioned, and man-made structures. They tend to be sensitive to that, so they like those wide open spaces. And yeah, so there's the chestnut collar longspur. I didn't include the thick-billed longspur, but it's the other one of the other two longspurs that we get. Actually, I guess we get 4 longspurs in Saskatchewan. And they'll have sort of similar habitat conditions. So both of the longspurs like that shorter grass and some bare ground. So, and I've tried to include some best management practices that, just in general for each bird. And there will be some themes that you'll see in the best management practices because it's hard to prescribe, individual things when I don't know operations or I don't know what your grazing regime is. But the important thing is that you can create the habitat conditions for all of these birds through grazing management of cattle. And, either through the management of watering or salt blocks and all that sort of thing, and hitting some of these places a little bit harder will create some of that management, or just having a long-term drought, I guess, will probably create a lot of that from these guys as well, which we seem to be having. Controlling woody vegetation, again, these guys really don't like any sort of woody vegetation for the most part, because that's a place for predators to perch. So either through grazing or chemical or mowing, or if you want to look into prescribed burning, but any sorts of those things just to control some of that woody vegetation. Again, avoiding fragment native pasture with roads or that sort of thing is a good general BMP. And if you are looking to seed down some cropland that maybe you're looking to put back into pasture, looking at using some of those native plants that won't form kind of a shrubby type growth, and using fine grasses is the biggest thing when trying to create habitat for some of these birds. So, sorry, I meant to mention off the top that if you have questions, feel free to kind of call them out if that's okay, Caitlin.
Yeah.
I'm just not lecturing you about birds. So, yeah, if you have some questions or clarifications, just let me know and we'll talk about it. So the second bird that I have is another fairly iconic, or I should have mentioned that the chestnut collared longspur carries a threatened designation under the Species at Risk Act as well. So unfortunately, we've lost it over 90% of chestnut collared longspurs in Prairie, Canada. Sprague's pipits, like I mentioned, so these are going to be kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of the type of habitat they like. And this is kind of the typical coloring for a lot of grassland birds, with the buff and kind of olive drab and streakiness on their back. They have a buff breast. As you can sort of see in the bottom picture, it's fairly clean except for sort of a necklace of streaks just along the top of their chest there. And I think one of the most distinctive features of this bird is that big dark eye that they have. And they have a very, while they kind of are colored like a lot of the sparrows that you might find, they have a very different body type to sparrows. There might be some bird people that might not be very happy with me for saying this, but I actually think that they look like a brown robin. They have kind of that same body type as some of those thrush species and other pipits that we get in Saskatchewan as well. So they're quite distinctive looking in terms of other grassland birds that are sort of the same color. Unfortunately, you won't see them on the ground very often. They're tough to spot and they tend to be in a longer vegetation, so they're tough to get a glimpse of, but you will hear them. They tend to sing when they're really high up in the sky. They fly somewhere 500 feet up, and they sing when they're up there. and that's the only place that they sing. They very rarely sing when they're on the ground, and they have a really distinctive sort of descending song that once you hear it once, you'll remember it forever, because it is really distinctive, and you can hear it for a mile. When we're doing point counts, actually, it's a bit of a problem, because you're trying to decide whether that bird is in the circle that you're supposed to be counting or not. So it's really quite a neat sound. Again, most grassland birds, when they're here in Saskatchewan and they're in their breeding territories, they're going to eat insects because they provide the highest quality sort of food stuff for them. So they'll eat a lot of grasshoppers and ground beetles and all those sorts of things. They do prefer native, but they can be found in tame grasslands. I've seen them certainly in tame grasslands in Manitoba as well. So, and again, kind of on the opposite spectrum of a long spur, they like something a little higher. So about the height of a pencil or double the height of a pencil is kind of what they're looking for in terms of vegetation height. And they like quite a bit of litter. And if you're scoring kind of healthy or healthy with problems on a range health assessment, then that's probably going to be in the ballpark of what they're looking for in terms of habitat conditions. And again, they don't really like those trees and shrubs. They don't like bare ground, so the chestnut collar monarchs like bare ground, these guys don't. And they have very similar habitat needs to Barred sparrow, which we're going to talk about next. So yes.
I can play this Frags Pipit right now.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people here have probably heard it. I've heard it a lot in the park
perfect.
and on private land.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've never seen one. I only hear a lot of them.
Yeah, I've been fortunate to see a couple of them actually, but yeah, they're really tough to see. Sometimes you can see the speck way up in the sky, but you have to be, pretty patient to see that. I did see one on the ground this summer, which was very exciting. But yeah, I find that that's very distinctive, and you hear that all over the place. So yeah, it's a great sound. Thank you very much. That's great. Yeah. Maybe I'll get you to cue up the Barred sparrow for next.
Yeah, sure. I got it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, so for Sprague's pipit, again, leaving some carryover, leaving some of that litter and letting it build up over time. You know, in some ways, you're probably going to find these guys in those lower areas where it's been wetter over hundreds of years, and some of that litter's been able to build up. But leaving some carryover is certainly, or if you're stockpile grazing or something like that, they'll key in on that. Controlling woody vegetation, again, is really important. Here, I'll just go into a little bit more detail on some of the different species that you can use if you are seeding down some areas to perennial forage, or if you're using some natives. I know that there's some funding coming through in terms of incorporating legumes into pastures. So if you are doing that, try to pick something that's going to grow along the ground more than grow up. So call that a prostrate legume. So something like purple prairie clover, which is a native, or if you're looking for something that's non-native, Sicer milkvetch or trefoil, something that's going to grow along the ground instead of something like alfalfa or sweet clover, especially sweet clover, which grows quite high and almost forms kind of like a shrub. So something that's going to grow a little bit lower, but they won't kind of mistake for a shrub essentially. So, and then using some of those finer grasses, if you're using non-native grasses, so kind of avoiding smooth brome, which tends to have like those broad leaves that grassland birds don't care for so much because we don't have a lot of broadleaf grasses, and crested wheatgrass just tends not to form that litter layer that Sprague's pipit like. Since these ones do use tame hay from time to time, if you can, delaying haying your tame species until July 15th just allows those all the grassland birds that use tame hay to get that first batch of kids fledged, and so that they can get out of the way of the cover bar, so that sort of thing. So that's a really good practice if you can wait that long. If you can't wait that long, maybe you can wait that long on some places, or you can leave some patches and that sort of thing, and we can talk more about that afterwards. But July 15th is kind of a magic date for most grassland birds in terms of when they get their kids able to fly. So next one, Baird sparrow. So as you can see, quite similarly colored in a lot of ways, but again, their body type is quite different. These look like a kind of a chunky sort of sparrow, and they have that sort of yellowish face and the pink bill, and then they have the mustache marks along the side, and then they've also got that sort of necklace of streaking just on the top of their breast there, which kind of sets them apart. It's something that you can use for different sparrows, is the streaking on their front. So Savannah sparrows have more streaking, and then grasshopper sparrows have more of just a clear breast and only yellow in front of the eye. If you're fortunate, again, to see one of these, which is it's sometimes tough. I actually haven't seen a Baird sparrow yet, but do you have the song?
Yeah, I told it.
Yeah, so it's kind of introductory notes and then a slow trill for Baird sparrow. You might have heard these guys as well. So it kind of really got quite a slow trill, whereas a grasshopper sparrow will sound a little bit more insect-like and that sort of thing. So yeah, not quite as insect-like for Baird sparrow, which makes them a little bit more distinctive when you're listening for them. So again, similar sort of habitat conditions for the Baird sparrow as the Sprague's pipit, really. So I won't spend tons of time on that, but they will tolerate a little bit of shrub cover. If it's, they'll avoid over 15%, but if there's some scattered shrubs, that's okay for these guys. Yeah, that's kind of similar sort of conditions. It's just very different for the most part, though. So it has similar sort of best management practices as well, leaving some carryover. Again, if you're looking at seeding down some cropland, trying to find things that will grow into that shrubby sort of growth pattern. And again, these ones will use a little bit of tame hay, so if you're able to wait for a little while longer until July 15th, then that will help these ones out quite a bit as well. So we'll go a little bit off the board now to one of my favorite birds, is the ferruginous hawk, kind of away from the songbirds. So yeah, these are the largest hawk that we get in North America. So they have about a 4.5 foot wingspan, and while these are my favorite birds, I am notoriously bad at raptor identification, so bear with me while I tell you how to tell these birds apart when I'm not very good at myself, but anyways. So their head is going to seem pretty big when they're flying along, and they have really broad wings, and they tend to have these little windows on the ends of their wings that are fairly distinctive for ferruginous hawks as well. And then the other thing, if they're in, let's see if I can get, not sure if I can get my cursor, but when they're in the light morph like this, so if you get a light ferruginous hawk, they're going to have, step over here, their legs are rust colored, so they've got kind of this V that will form when they're in flight that you can pick out that is brown on there. I've seen people describe it as a rusty diaper, which but that's fairly distinctive for these guys. So as far as nesting, they tend to nest in those isolated trees along riparian areas and that sort of thing, or on rocky edges and outcrops. And if they can't find any of that, then they'll occasionally nest on the ground. They'll primarily eat small mammals, especially Richardson ground squirrels or gophers. They're a favorite of these ones, and a pair will actually eat up to about 500 Richardson ground squirrels in a season, so they'll catch a lot of them. And they rely mainly on large tracts of native grassland. They usually like something that's bigger than a section, but they will use smaller areas, and they will hunt in smaller grasslands as well. So any sort of grass that gets kept will help the kids. So kind of a common theme. So we had chestnut collar longspur that liked the shorter grass. We had spray spigot and barred sparrow that liked the longer grass. These guys will use both. So creating that mosaic and that variability of structure within a pasture or a grassland is really key for the whole group of grassland birds. And ferruginous hawks are no different. They like to forage in some of those places that are shorter so that you can see their prey, but then they'll hunker down in some of those longer grass areas and that sort of thing. So things that you can do is creating that mosaic, trying to restrict grazing in those riparian areas where those isolated trees and those nesting sites might be, so using off-site watering and that sort of thing will help. If you are replacing trees like in a shelter belt or something like that, try to choose native species like cottonwoods, which they'll prefer to nest in. And again, a lot of their life focuses around gophers and Richardson ground squirrels. So if you can tolerate Richardson ground squirrels, that's the biggest thing, and keeping that food source. And you might be able to talk to some local funders and that sort of thing to be able to maybe build a nesting structure right on top of a colony if you've got one, and they might work at cleaning them up for you because they do eat a ton of them. If you do have to control Richardson ground squirrels through poisoning, try to do that later in the year after most of our hawks have gone south, so kind of November to March, so that you're not inadvertently harming some of these hawks. This is something that I kind of just read up on a little bit before I came out here, so but using lead ammunition, especially hollow point ammunition, tends to fragment when it gets inside a gopher, and then those raptors will eat a lot of that lead, and that tends to reduce their fitness and can also lead to be fatal in some instances. So if you are considering controlling Richardson ground squirrel through shooting them, consider ammunition that's made out of copper instead. And I did check, you can track that down in Canada for 22 shell, something to look into. And then the biggest thing, if you are lucky enough to have a pair on your place, just give them lots of space during the nesting season. From March 15th to July 15th, just give them lots of room. If you're on foot or in your truck or anything like that, try to give them about a half a click. And if there's any sort of heavy equipment, anything bigger than a 1-ton truck or tractor or anything like that, try to give them 750 meters. And if you do have some work planned, like drilling or digging, not so much maybe digging a dugout, that probably is more like 750 meters, but if there's going to be extended sort of work, try to give them a kilometer just so that you're not disturbing them. So, yeah. So that kind of wraps up the individual birds. Like I say, I just kind of picked a few that I thought maybe might be interesting to talk about. And then I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of the work that Birds Canada does, and just some of the importance of the grasslands. Many of you will know this, so it's going to be a little bit of a reiteration, but just want to talk a little bit about our connection with producers and that sort of thing. So I mentioned that this is a complex landscape, so that's ecologically, but also land use and land ownership. So 90% of the remaining grasslands in Canada are privately owned, and most of those are by cattle producers. So prairie producers and landowners play a really significant and key role in keeping habitat intact. And one of the best mechanisms that we have on the prairies and really throughout Western North America is keeping cattle on the landscape and keeping those grasslands intact. These prairie plants evolved with grazing, and in the absence of free-roaming bison, well-managed cattle can do a really good job of creating that structure and creating those habitats that grassland birds need in order to fulfill their life cycle. And you know, there's all sorts of talk about carbon all the time now, and grasslands are a really significant carbon sink. They actually secure about 200 tons or upwards of 200 tons of carbon in their root systems, which is actually more than tropical forests lots of times. So grasslands are a really significant carbon sink. So this all being said, temperate grasslands, as many of you will know, are one of the most endangered but least protected ecosystems on the planet. So having cattle out on landscape and having it as a working landscape is going to be really important for keeping grasslands intact. And places like Grasslands National Park and Indigenous protected areas are going to play a really key role in that. But surrounding those areas, we need working landscapes that are going to foster biodiversity and provide homes for these birds. So this is a bit of a relic from more of a general presentation that I gave, but just sometimes we have consumers asking what can they do to help support grassland conservation and grassland bird conservation, and kind of just say, if you choose to eat beef, just make sure that you're eating Canadian beef first and foremost. That's going to support a system where cattle have been on grass for a lot of their life cycle. Grass-fed, grass-finished, same thing. Supporting systems that use grasslands. Birds Canada has been working really closely with the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef on some of their biodiversity and sustainability goals. So if you happen across some CRSB certified beef and want to give it a try, that's another system that helps keep grasslands intact and helps provide homes for birds.
Ian, how would someone get a hold of that organization?
Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, it's a bit few and far between. Walmart actually sells some Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and there are a few restaurants, McDonald's actually, I think their Quarter Pounders have the CRSB certified beef, and a few other restaurants and that sort of thing. So it's still kind of getting rolled out a little bit, but yeah.
How would a landowner be able to market to that?
Oh, okay, yeah. So if you go to their website, Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and get a hold of, yeah, that's a good question, but I think there's a contact us.
Yeah. I think they have a for producers section too. You can just click there, and then like they come and do inspections and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I'll
So
get tied in with them. Okay.
Yeah. So it's a certification process similar to other ones. So there would be certain boxes that you have to tick in order to, and there's an audit process and of course a fee that goes along with that. But yeah, so that's. But yeah, if there's a for producers section on there, you're right, Caitlin. Yeah. So we have to get some more information there.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting.
So, in terms of some barriers and opportunities for grasslands, like I mentioned previously, due to some potentially higher commodity prices and some things that are built into our agricultural system, it often makes very little financial sense for producers to keep grass intact if they are able to, or if they could be growing annual crops. So a lot of that is driving grassland loss because it just makes very little financial sense or more financial sense to grow crops rather than keep that grassland intact if they can make it go out of grain farming. So that's not to say that grain farming is bad or it's easy or it's not necessary, but just to say that there are fairly significant risk and revenue gaps sometimes between grass-based production systems and some of those annual production systems. So at Birds Canada, part of my role is to try looking at ways that we can contribute to grassland conservation and explore some avenues to be able to make those grass-based and biodiverse production systems more financially viable and integrating some biodiversity into our landscape. So a few things that we do to try to accomplish that. We have a couple of publications. The first one is the Grassland Conservation Incentives Guide. So this is a publication where we try to put all the different stewardship and conservation funding opportunities that exist on the prairies and put them in one spot so that it was a little bit easier for producers to be able to track down what might fit their situation and get a little bit more information about that so they don't have to spend maybe hours and hours searching on the internet trying to track that down. So that's the first one, and I'm kind of going through an update of that right now to make sure that it's all up to date. The second one is connecting producers to some of the resources that they might want to look at in terms of biodiversity and climate friendly production practices. So some of those things that I mentioned before in terms of creating habitat for chestnut Carl longspurs and Barred sparrow, there are resources contained within this that are going to be able to guide you in the right direction there. Many of them are found on the PCAP website actually. So if you are looking for another one-stop shop, that's a great place to look. There's a lot of really great resources on there. So that's one of the publications. And then another thing that we're working on in terms of trying to contribute to grassland conservation and try to improve the biodiversity in a working landscape is working on something called the Bird Friendliness Index, which is an outcome-based indicator that uses the bird community as a representation of the biodiversity on a farm or ranch. So we're looking at adapting and developing this as a potential tool for producers to be able to use as a way to communicate biodiversity that they have on their property, and hopefully be able to, by providing that measure and that communication tool, to be able to allow a mechanism for producers to be able to fairly compensated for that biodiversity and that societal good that they're providing, and maybe be able to enable some policy and market tools based on this so that we can kind of close some of those risk and revenue gaps between grass-based and biodiverse production systems and some of those other production systems as well. So it's been a really interesting project, and I was hoping to have some results, but we're still crunching some numbers and that sort of thing. But we've been working in Manitoba and Saskatchewan over the last 2 years and doing a lot of bird surveys in the process to develop and adapt this. And this is one of our summer students, Erica, out on the grassland somewhere in southwestern Saskatchewan. So in 2021, we did about 1,200 total surveys in between the two provinces. And 2022, we did just about 2,100 surveys and representing about 310,000 acres across the two provinces. And we work really closely with South of the Divide Conservation Action Program and the Saskatchewan Stock Growers Foundation to get onto some of the ranches that are participating with them. And it's been a really good experience, and we've seen lots of really neat things. And we do surveys through both the in-person point counts that you see Erica doing here, and we also use autonomous recording units, which is mostly what I do because I'm not a bird expert, so I get to be a mule and track these things around through southwestern Manitoba for the most part, and put them out. They stay out for about a week, and then they record in 5-minute segments in the morning and 3-minute segments during the night. And it's been really interesting to hear some of the things that we've been able to pick up, because we're listening at times that are not always easy to listen for the most part, because we can program them and then listen to them in the winter. So I always throw this in just because it's a neat thing, but we actually detected a bird called the common whirlwill in Manitoba, which is only the 4th and 5th detections of common whirlwill in Manitoba ever. So we had 2 separate ones in 2021, and the only other detections were in the 30s, and then one in 1999. So it was kind of an interesting find, especially in 2 quite different habitats. The one on the left is quite hilly for Manitoba, and then the other one is more what you would expect in Manitoba, quite flat and surrounded by quite a bit of cropland. So it was interesting that they would be in such different places actually. So, and through working with the ranchers and farmers that we do work with, both in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, we try to have it as a learning experience on both sides and a bit of a knowledge transfer for both entities. So we provide some reports on the birds that we find. We flag up some of the more interesting birds or the species at risk, and we sit down with producers and talk about some of what we found and where we found them and all that sort of thing, and total numbers, and then we provide some interesting facts and some habitat conditions that they like and some of the best management practices as well. So that's, yeah. And then if you're interested in learning some more about kind of Birds Canada's stance on beef production and all that sort of thing, we have some blogs that we put out on our website at birdscanada.org/grasslands, and we also have some more information about the bird friendliness index and all that sort of thing on there as well. To wrap up, I just wanted to touch on some of the citizen science things that we do at Birds Canada, but also some of the other opportunities across Saskatchewan. So one of the things that I really like to promote is the North American Breeding Bird Survey. So if you are somebody that is interested in getting, or is a birder, or interested in getting into birding, this is a long-running survey that really helps us. It contributes directly to our bird friendliness index work, and it also helps give us long-term trend data to really understand what's happening with birds. So there are actually about 70 breeding bird survey routes in Saskatchewan that are currently vacant. So if you're interested in picking up one of those, please, by all means, get a hold of Barry Robinson at the Canadian Wildlife Service, and he'd be more than happy to have you do some routes, because that's a really important set of data that we really quite need. So some other long-term running programs that are maybe a little bit easier to get into. The Christmas Bird Count is a long-running program. All the circles that you see on there are Christmas bird counts that exist, and there will be coordinators that are happy to take you out and help you count some birds and contribute to, again, long-term trend data that is really important for monitoring trends in species. As well as Project Feeder Watch, which is even easier because you can do it from your kitchen window. You don't even actually need a feeder anymore. It's just keeping track of birds over a 2-day window in the wintertime, and again, helps us understand what's going on with all those birds that overwinter here. So you can do it for longer than 2 days, but 2 days is kind of the minimum that we ask. But again, really easy sort of stepping stone to get into citizen science. And then something else that helps us out a lot too, while you're out on the landscape and you're seeing some birds, is using eBird. There's an app on your phone that you're able to just click and see, or click and enter what birds you're seeing and how many, and we use this data all the time. I actually used it to kind of focus where we're going to do surveys in Manitoba this year, so that's really helpful data to us as well. So it's really amazing what the technology's been able to do for monitoring birds and enabling a lot of people to be able to contribute to science. And there is going to be a marsh bird monitoring program that's going to start up in Saskatchewan here quite soon. So if you're interested in not camping out, but sitting out by some wetlands for a little while and counting the birds that you see, that's a program that's going to be up and running here shortly as well. There's lots more than that. I obviously didn't have time to talk about all of them, but if you want to go to birdscanada.org, and there's a citizen, you can help in the citizen science drop down, and it has all the different programs that you can get involved with. And I'm just going to end off on, for those of you that are gardeners, Birds Canada has a tool called birdgardens.ca that really tries to guide you through picking species that are good for birds, good for pollinators, and native plants that are going to be suitable for your area and suitable for what you want in your garden, whether you want full sun or shade, or you want shrubs or vines, all those sorts of things. It's really, really helpful tool that here's just a screenshot from when I was using it, trying to find something for my backyard. So you can put in where you live in terms of your gardening zone, which it guides you through where your gardening zone is and all that sort of thing, and then pick, like I mentioned, whether you want full sun or what kind of soil you've got, and then it gives you different plant types. And then there's also resources in terms of where to source those from as well. So that's a really, really good tool for those of you that want to attract birds and pollinators to your backyards. So that's it for me. I do want to just take a couple of minutes here to thank our sponsors and our partners and our funders. We work closely with the Saskatchewan Stock Growers Foundation on a lot of our work here in Saskatchewan, and with the Weston Family Foundation funded work. We also get funding from Environment and Climate Change Canada, the Conservation Trust in Manitoba, the Fish and Wildlife Development Fund, so that's hunters and anglers that through buying stamps that will contribute to that, and I think donations as well. And like I mentioned, the Self-Applied Conservation Action Program, we work quite closely with them as well. And if you want to know more, there's more information on our webpage about some of the work that we do. So yeah, and that's it for me.